First of all, thanks to Latin American Studies and to my old friend Ken Roberts. Ken and I have been friends for more than 30 years. And as we were just talking, we shared an office in Stanford's Latin American Studies Center more than 3 decades ago. It's a long time. So just 2 years ago, international observers, while they were fretting a lot about the rise of populism in Europe and the United States, but they, 2 years ago, were breathing a sigh of relief about Latin America, because Latin America seemed to be experiencing a turn to the liberal right. Argentines elected Mauricio Macri in 2015. Peruvians elected Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, PPK, in 2016. Chileans elected Sebastián Piñera in 2017. And international observers, particularly establishment observers, were giddy. The dominant narrative in the media was this: Latin Americans had put populism behind them, and they were now turning back to market-oriented, pro-Western, pro-US governments that Americans could love. 2 years later, that right turn is a freaking dumpster fire. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the right turn that wasn't, but I also want to talk about another darker right turn that may be, and then finish up by talking a little bit about what the hell's going on in Chile. All right, before we talk about the right turn that wasn't, I want to take a quick look back at the left turn that was. Between 1998 and 2009, as Ken mentioned, the left won the presidency in Venezuela, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and El Salvador. This was a stunning turn to the left, surpassing anything ever seen in Latin America. For more than a decade, the Latin American left did nothing but win. It was reelected once in El Salvador and Chile. It was reelected twice in Argentina, Uruguay, and Bolivia. Also Ecuador, and elected 3 times in Brazil and 4 times in Venezuela. Now, in our book, Ken and I argued that 2 long-term causes drove this turn to the left: inequality and democracy. Inequality creates a natural constituency for the left. It means that there's a larger pool of voters who are receptive to parties that promise redistribution. But the other condition, crucial condition that made the left turn possible was democracy. For most of Latin American history, left parties didn't win because they couldn't contest for power. They were banned, they were repressed, and whenever the left won power, it was very, very often toppled by coups. Venezuela in 1948, Guatemala in 1954, the Dominican Republic in 1963, Brazil in 1964, Chile in 1973. That changed dramatically with the end of the Cold War. Now, for the first time in history, the left can compete legally for power everywhere in Latin America, except paradoxically for Cuba. And in addition to that, military coups have more or less disappeared, which means that the left can not only win, but it can actually govern. So inequality created a constituency for left-wing parties, and democracy gave the left a real chance to compete for power. Those conditions made the left turn of the first decade of the 21st century possible. But to explain the timing of the left turn, why it happened when it did, we have to look at economic conditions. Now, many people saw or see the rise of the left in Latin America as a response to neoliberalism. In other words, Latin Americans turned to the left as sort of a backlash against the free market reforms of the 1990s. But the evidence for this backlash against neoliberalism theory is really not that great. The left won power in some places that carried out dramatic neoliberal reforms, Chile, Argentina, but the left also won in places where there were very few or very insignificant neoliberal reforms, like Venezuela and Ecuador. And besides, neoliberals got reelected wherever economies performed well. They got reelected in the mid-1990s in Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Peru. So it's not clear that voters were rejecting neoliberalism per se. What triggered the wave of left-wing victories in Latin America was the economic crisis of the late 1990s. Beginning in 1998, economies throughout Latin America tanked. Per capita GDP region-wide declined by 2% between 1997 and 2002. Levels of poverty, unemployment, inequality increased in just about every country in the region. That economic crisis did 2 things. First of all, it did what it does in all democracies. It hurt incumbents. When incumbents do not perform well, voters throw them out, at least in democracies, in favor of opposition. Latin American incumbents did not perform well between 1997 and 2002, so they lost. Between 1998 and 2004, incumbent parties lost the presidency in 14 out of 18 Latin American democracies. Who were those incumbents between 1998 and 2004? They were mostly center or center-right governments who had embraced the free market project of the 1990s. Who was in opposition during this period? In many cases, it was figures or parties on the left. The second thing that the economic crisis in the late 90s and early 2000s did was erode public support for market-oriented policies. By 2004, more than 70% of survey respondents said they were dissatisfied with the performance of the market economy in Latin America. So not only did the economic crisis turn Latin American voters against incumbents, but at that time it turned them against neoliberalism. This meant that Latin American voters were not just oriented towards the opposition, but they were oriented towards opposition candidates who promised some sort of an alternative to neoliberalism. Now, beginning in 2002, economic conditions helped the left in a second way, by giving governments money to spend. The debt crisis, as most of you know, in the 1980s and 1990s, left Latin American governments with very, very little room to maneuver. Governments were essentially bankrupt, which meant that they were forced, among other things, to accept the policy constraints imposed by the IMF. Very few governments in the 1990s had the wherewithal to challenge the Washington consensus. But beginning in 2002, Latin America experienced an extraordinary commodities boom. In South America in particular, exports tripled, quadrupled, quintupled in the first decade of the 21st century. That export boom did several important things. First of all, it accelerated economic growth. Latin American economies grew at an average rate of 5% a year between 2003 and 2011. That was the highest sustained growth in decades in most of the region. And crucially, the export boom provided Latin American governments with the resources to actually govern on the left. So instead of running trade and current accounts deficits, as they had for decades, Latin American governments, for the first time in a generation, were running surpluses. That meant for the first time in decades, governments actually had money in the treasury. That allowed governments to increase social spending, in some cases dramatically, and it also transformed Latin American governments' relationships with the international financial community. Brazil and Argentina paid off their entire debt to the IMF. Even Bolivia could afford for a while to thumb its nose at the IMF. So suddenly Latin American governments had much more room to maneuver than they'd had in the 80s and 90s, and that opened up space to experiment with left-of-center policies. So much of the left turn can be attributed to changing economic conditions. Starting in 1998, an economic crisis led Latin American voters to throw out right-of-center incumbents in favor of candidates who promised some sort of alternative to neoliberalism. And after 2002, a commodities boom provided left governments with the resources to do things that they could not have dreamed about a decade earlier. Now, over the last several years, the pink tide, the so-called pink tide, has begun to ebb. The beginning of that end, the beginning of this ebbing, was actually not very democratic. In Honduras, 10 years ago, populist President Manuel Zelaya was overthrown in a coup, 2009. In Paraguay, leftist priest Fernando Lugo was impeached in 2012 in what was essentially a show trial. And in Brazil in 2016, Dilma Rousseff was removed in a highly politicized impeachment. But in 2015, the left actually started to lose elections. In 2015, in Argentina, Peronism was defeated by Mauricio Macri. In Chile, the governing center-left coalition was defeated by Sebastián Piñera. In Brazil, the PT's effort to come back was thwarted by right-wing candidate Jair Bolsonaro. In El Salvador, the FMLN lost to an outsider, Nayib Bukele, and the left is about to lose, I think, in Uruguay as well. Why is the left turn ending? For the most part, it's ending for the same reason it began, the economy. The left turn, again, began in the wake of the late 1990s economic crisis, which eroded support for the center-right. It was sustained for more than a decade because of an economic boom. It came to an end because the economic boom, the commodities boom in particular, came to an end. So after growing at a rate of about 5% a year between 2003 and 2011, Latin American economies were pretty close to stagnant between 2015 and 2018. In some countries, in Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela, economies were much worse than stagnant. They were in severe crisis. Again, when times are bad, voters throw out the incumbents. Today, many of the incumbents, or in the last decade, many of the incumbents have been on the left, and so they're losing. Now, initially, the decline of the left was interpreted as a victory for market liberalism, as a sort of resurgent market liberalism. Again, Macri, Kuczynski in Peru, Piñera in Chile were center-right liberals. They were moderate politicians who were committed to both free markets and democracy. So liberal international observers, The Economist magazine, were overjoyed. These guys, they began to write article after article after article about how Latin Americans had woken up from their populist hangover and were turning back to responsible, market-oriented leaders. But there was no center-right wave. It just didn't happen. First of all, Macri, Kuczynski, Piñera turned out to be the only moderate center-right figures elected in the region. Between 2015 and 2019, in what was supposed to be the right turn, the left was reelected in Bolivia, Costa Rica, and Ecuador. Mexicans and Panamanians turned from the right to the center-left. In El Salvador, voters rejected the left, but instead of voting for the right, they chose a populist outsider. And in Brazil and Colombia, the center-right candidates that The Economist liked were defeated by extremist right-wing candidates. Now, what about those market-oriented presidents that The Economist was raving about? Complete and total catastrophe, train wreck. Kuczynski lasted for less than 2 years before he was forced to resign in a corruption scandal. Macri failed to revive the Argentine economy. He was thrown out by voters last month. And Piñera is currently facing one of the most massive sustained waves of protest in modern Latin American history. His approval rating has fallen to 14%, and he's facing widespread calls for his resignation. So there has not been much of a right turn in Latin America. If you look at the 8 biggest countries in Latin America, 3 out of 8 are governed by the left: Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina. 2 of 8 have centrist governments, Peru and Ecuador. 2 of 8 have far-right governments, Brazil and Colombia. And 1 has a center-right government, that's Chile. So that's 3 left, 3 right, 2 center. Rather than a turn to the right, what we're seeing is a return to what was, I think, the dominant pattern in the 1980s and 90s, which is one in which incumbents usually lose. Latin America is a hard place to govern. And it's a hard place to govern in large part because of state weakness. By state weakness, I mean the inability of state institutions to carry out really basic tasks: collecting taxes, building roads, implementing social programs, providing public security, protecting, educating, vaccinating people. When states are weak, when states do not work well, it is almost impossible for governments to govern well, no matter how honest they are, no matter how well-intentioned they may be. When states can't tax, when governments can't get bureaucrats to do what they want, when they cannot enforce the rule of law, even the best of governments are not going to be able to deliver the goods. They won't be able to pave roads, to provide security, to protect consumers, to keep schools and hospitals supplied. And when governments fail to deliver the goods, they lose public support. Voters are not stupid. The combination of weak states and pretty volatile economies means that incumbent governments are often pretty unpopular in Latin America, and as a result, incumbents often lose. In Peru, in Ecuador, in Panama, and Guatemala, incumbents never once won elections in the 1980s and 1990s. In Argentina, they won once. Now, the commodities boom of the early 2000s briefly changed this pattern. But with the end of the boom, starting around 2014, the old pattern is reemerging. Governments govern pretty badly, they lose public support, and voters throw them out. So voters have not turned to the right. They're probably not turning back to the left, but they're turning against incumbents of all political stripes. All right, I want to finish with 2 big points that may or may not be disjointed. First of all, we are seeing a right turn of sorts in Latin America, one that's ongoing. But it's not the right turn that The Economist dreamed about. It's a turn to a much darker, illiberal right. During the 1990s, during the early 2000s, the most influential parties on the Latin American right were broadly liberal. They were liberal in the sense that they supported free markets, but they also broadly embraced democracy, human rights, basic civil rights. That's pretty important. It's pretty important that the major parties of the right embrace liberal democracy. I'm talking about the PAN in Mexico, the Social Democrats in Brazil, National Renovation in Chile, the Colorados and the Blancos in Uruguay, the Liberals in Colombia, the PRO in Argentina, the National Advancement Party in Guatemala, Social Christians in Costa Rica. For these parties in the 1990s and early 2000s, the priority was free market reform. Social and cultural issues, things like abortion, gay rights, were secondary to these parties. Now, these center-right parties, these free market parties, achieved a lot of what they wanted in the 1990s. Free market reforms were adopted to varying degrees across Latin America. So programmatically, these guys got what they were looking for. But as Ken has been telling us for many years now, liberal right parties utterly failed to build broad or sustained electoral coalitions. Neoliberalism just did not win votes. And as a result, many center-right parties, many liberal right parties in Latin America are now being overtaken by illiberal forces on their right flank. By illiberal, I mean parties that devalue or even attack individual rights, especially minority rights. In Latin America, the illiberal right has two main wings. It's got a security wing, it has a religious wing. So it's guns and gods. Gun and God. I guess it's monotheistic for the most part. Okay. The security wing, the guns wing, champions public security over the protection of rights. So it promises to take a strong hand, a mano dura, against criminals and against leftist subversives, even if that means violating international norms, even if that means violating legal niceties like due process. So the idea is to throw off the fetters and wage war on the bad guys, even if that means violating the rights of suspected criminals, even if it means victimizing poor and non-white citizens, and in some cases, even if it means embracing extrajudicial killing and torture. Many on the illiberal right, on the emerging illiberal right in Latin America, dismiss the very notion of human rights as a Marxist invention. Some of them praise past military dictatorships as models for how to provide order and security. So that's a guns wing. The religious wing focuses on the defense of traditional values against the expansion of secularism, women's rights, and especially gay rights. They've mobilized around issues of gay marriage, abortion, sexual education. So here the emphasis is on preserving traditional societal values, even if that means restricting or eliminating the rights of non-traditional minorities. Now, the security wing and the religious wing have a lot of differences ideologically, but they tend to hang together, at least in contemporary Latin America. They tend to be part of the same coalition. This is Fujimorismo in Peru, it's Uribismo in Colombia, it is Bolsonaro in Brazil. Look around Latin America, and it's pretty clear that the illiberal right is beginning to eclipse the liberal right across much of the region. Take Brazil, maybe the leading case. For 25 years, Brazil's dominant right-of-center party was Fernando Henrique Cardoso's Social Democratic Party. That was a broadly centrist, maybe center-right party that combined free market economics with secularism and social liberalism. But the PSDB collapsed in 2018. It won 5% of the vote. And much of the right-wing vote was captured by Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro appealed very explicitly to both the guns wing and the God wing. He embraced torture, he embraced death squads, and suggested that he would strip away the rights of leftists, of homosexuals, of indigenous people. In Colombia, the liberal right, which had been represented by the Santos government, has been politically defeated, if not eclipsed, by the followers of former President Álvaro Uribe. The Uribistas are hardline security types. They're definitely in the guns faction. They're associated with paramilitary groups responsible for killing hundreds of leftist union leaders and human rights activists. In 2016, the Uribistas teamed up with evangelical Christians to oppose the government's peace accord with the FARC guerrillas, and they defeated the peace accord in a referendum. 2 years later, 2018, Uribista candidate Ivan Duque won the presidency, while Santos's candidate, the sort of mainstream liberal candidate, won just 7% of the vote. Now, in Peru, the liberal right has always been pretty weak, but in 2016, it sort of accidentally won the presidency behind Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, PPK. But PPK was eaten alive by Fujimorismo, which is the party of the illiberal right. Like Uribismo, Fujimorismo comes from the guns wing. Former President Alberto Fujimori is the guy who's widely known for defeating the Shining Path guerrillas, but he also engaged in pretty serious human rights violations for which he is now in prison. Now, under Fujimori's daughter, Keiko, also in prison, by the way, Fujimorismo brought together evangelical Christians, conservative Catholics, former military and police officials, and other conservatives into a broad illiberal right coalition. That force became the dominant force in Peruvian politics, winning an outright majority in Congress in 2016 and coming inches away from winning the presidency. In Costa Rica, the center-right Social Christian Unity Party fell to 4th place in the 2018 election. It was displaced by Fabricio Alvarado, an evangelical Christian a musician who ran basically a single-issue campaign of opposition to gay marriage. Alvarado finished 2nd. He was defeated in the runoff. In Chile, the illiberal right is represented by a guy named Jose Antonio Cast, who recently broke with the established right and created a new right-wing party called Republican Action. Cast is positioning himself to run for president in 2021 as a Bolsonaro-like figure, on a Bolsonaro-like platform. He defends Pinochet's human rights record and has come out very strongly against gay rights and against immigration, which is a big issue in Chile. Even in Uruguay, far and away the most liberal country in South America, an illiberal right-wing party called Cabildo Abierto, led by a former general, came out of nowhere and won 10% of the vote in elections last week. So what accounts for this? What accounts for the fairly dramatic rise of the illiberal right? One of the main reasons is violent crime. Throughout history, as I'm sure you all know, fear and insecurity have pushed societies to the political right. They helped to foster fascism in Europe, bureaucratic authoritarianism in South America, genocidal dictatorship in Central America. Insecurity breeds fear, and fear leads people very often to embrace leaders who promise a strong hand. We saw this with the rise of Fujimorismo in Peru in the 1990s, with the rise of Uribe in Colombia in the early 21st century. But today the problem is not insurgency so much as it is violent crime. Violent crime rates in Latin America are far and away the highest in the world. So in Western democracies, in Canada, in the UK, in Spain, there are an average of between 1 and 2 homicides per 100,000 per year. In the United States, which has easily the highest homicide rate in the industrialized world, there were 4 homicides per 100,000 people last year. 4. In Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, there were 25 homicides per 100,000 last year. In Honduras, there were 40 homicides per 100,000 last year. In El Salvador, there were 51 homicides per 100,000. In Venezuela, there were 81 homicides per 100,000. That is 20 times the rate of the United States. It's 80 times the rate of Spain and the UK. Rising crime rates have generated widespread fear, frustration, and discontent, which means that there is a constituency for politicians who promise to sweep away legal niceties and apply a strong hand, a mano dura. This is what Uribe did successfully in Colombia. It's what Duterte has done so successfully in the Philippines. That is the model. Promise bullets for the bad guys and you win votes. And again, this is not an invented problem. Latin America's homicide rate is nearly 5 times that of the United States. It's 30 times higher than Europe. Of the 20 most violent countries in the world, in terms of homicides, 17 are in Latin America. So crime is one thing pushing folks to the illiberal right. The other one is the rise of evangelical Christianity. Pentecostalism has been on the rise for decades in Latin America. Between 1960 and 1990, the number of evangelicals doubled in Chile, Paraguay, and Venezuela, tripled in Argentina, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic, quadrupled in Brazil, quintupled in Peru, El Salvador, Bolivia, and increased sevenfold in Guatemala. Today, 40% of Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Nicaraguans are Protestant, about 35% of Salvadorans, and about a quarter of Chileans and Brazilians are evangelical Protestants. Now, during the 20th century, evangelicals are not new in Latin America. Throughout the 20th century, they laid low politically because they were fearful of the wrath of the Catholic Church. They were fearful that the Catholic Church would use its influence to stomp on. But in the early 21st century, in the last decade or two, evangelical Christians have begun to flex their political muscle across Latin America, and they're adopting positions increasingly that are similar to the Christian right in the United States. And because Christians are based in churches, evangelical political movements tend to be pretty well organized. In fact, the evangelical political movement may be the strongest, best organized social movement in Peru today. The ascent of the illiberal right, I think, poses a real threat to democracy in Latin America. Illiberal politicians, whether the left or the right, reject some of the core principles of democracy. They reject things like human rights, civil liberties, and equality before the law. You simply cannot sustain democracy without individual rights. For me, the nightmare model is Duterte in the Philippines. That's a case where illiberal policies, anti-crime policies, generated broad public support, which allowed the Duterte government to slowly chip away at democratic institutions. The politician who's best positioned to be Latin America's Duterte is Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is an openly authoritarian figure. He embraces torture, extrajudicial killing, and military rule. If Bolsonaro were to succeed politically, he could easily become a model for others in Latin America, somewhat like Brazil's 1964 military coup was a model for others in the region. Now, fortunately, Bolsonaro has not been very successful. Brazil's economy remains pretty stagnant. Bolsonaro is not the brightest of politicians. His approval rating is stuck in the 30s. That is probably good news. Bolsonaro's failure, his political failure, potentially will take some of the shine off of the illiberal model, just as Maduro's failure has taken a lot of shine off the Bolivarian model in the Andes. But still, I worry a lot about the rise of the illiberal right. Basic rights, basic individual rights have expanded enormously in Latin America over the last 30 or 40 years. I don't think we give this nearly enough attention or credit. Latin America's human rights record during the first 2 decades of the 21st century was easily better than any other period in Latin American history. There's also been a dramatic expansion of civil liberties, freedom of the press, speech, and association. Outside of Europe and North America, Latin America has easily the best civil liberties record in the world. Finally, there's been a pretty significant expansion of minority rights in Latin America. Across the region, we've seen new laws against domestic violence, against racial discrimination, laws protecting indigenous minorities, unprecedented protection of LGBT rights. Same-sex marriage is now legal in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Colombia, Ecuador, parts of Mexico. In short, Latin America has become much, much more liberal over the last 30 years. Human rights, civil liberties, minority rights are now better protected than ever before in Latin American history. We are now seeing a pushback against that rights expansion. This is a trend that anybody who cares about democracy should worry about, because without solid liberal foundations, both the quality and ultimately the stability of democracy are imperiled. All right, I want to close with a few words about what's happening in Chile. Chile, of course, is a great example of the right turn that was not. Piñera was at Harvard a few years ago, right before he was reelected, talking about how he's going to restore markets to Chile, etc. His triumphant return to the market is literally in flames. But I think the issue in Chile is much more than just the failure of the right. Chile may be showing us the limits of unequal democracy in Latin America. Scholars have long argued that there is a fundamental incompatibility between democracy and extreme social inequality. When you place a democracy in a highly unequal society, one of two things is likely to happen. Either the rich will feel threatened and back a coup, like in Chile in 1973, or the rich will use their wealth and power essentially to rig democratic institutions through things like lobbying, campaign finance, corruption, and clientelism. In other words, through some combination of legal, informal, and illicit means, the rich will gain enough influence in Congress, in the courts, in the bureaucracy, in the media to protect their interests. And as a result, you get a democracy that's not very democratic. Much more like an oligarchy. Now, during the 1990s and the early 2000s, the Chileans seemed to show us that democracy can, in fact, do well in conditions of extreme inequality. Chilean politicians, at least from a political scientist standpoint, seemed to do everything right. They governed democratically, they shared power, they weren't too corrupt, and the center-left concertation governments invested heavily in social policy. The poverty rate fell from more than 40% when Pinochet left power to just 14% today. Even inequality, income inequality, came down. Chile's Gini score fell from 57% in 1990 to 45.9% today. That is a significant drop in income inequality. I would even say, not everyone would agree with me, that the Chilean party system has been pretty responsive. The concertation governed in the center in the 1990s and early 2000s, but when massive student protests erupted in 2010, 2011, sort of placing new demands from the left, Michelle Bachelet, who was running for president, opened up the concertation coalition, included the Communist Party, included leaders of the student protest movement, and incorporated many of the protesters' leading demands into her platform, including free higher education. That's pretty responsive. So this is not Venezuela in the 1980s. Chile's political elite did a bunch of things right, and yet Chilean democracy is still under siege. This may be because Chilean democracy has not been able to deal with the consequences of extreme social inequality. For many Chileans, the system still seems to be rigged in favor of the rich, and they're not wrong. In many respects, it is. And you can tell a similar story about Brazil. Chile and Brazil in particular remind us that it's really, really hard to make democracy work in a highly stratified society. So Chile may be headed for a new constitution. I don't usually personally I'm not an institutionalist. I don't usually place a lot of stock in institutional design, but I think a new constitutional process in Chile is pretty appropriate. And what emerges from that process, if there is a new constituent assembly and a new constitution writing process, what emerges from that process may be quite important. Remember, there are a bunch of things in Chile that work well. Chile has an effective state. It doesn't have a weak state. Chile has an effective rule of law. Chile's got pretty strong institutions. This is not Bolivia or Ecuador, where it's hard to take constitutional innovation seriously because constitutions literally change every decade. If Chileans manage to develop, say, some new institutional innovations to help to democratize or to deepen their democracy, those innovations may well have teeth. Those innovations may well stick. And if they achieve any success, those innovations could become models for other democracies in the region. So Chile may not be headed for a left-wing revolution, but I think there's an opportunity for some real good to come out of the current crisis. Let me stop there. Thanks.